We begin the story in Exodus with a failure of memory. And it all begins to unwind from there. So here's what's happened. If you recall from the book of Genesis, there was a famine in the land of Israel, but it wasn't the land of Israel yet because Israel was not a nation yet. And here's what you find throughout Exodus. It's an important point as you begin to study this passage, is Israel is a people when they're in bondage, but they are not a nation until they walk through it and come out into deliverance. And so here, they're not a nation. They've just got someone in their family that's been named Israel, but it's not even his first name. He started off Jacob. He becomes Israel. There was that whole wrestling match with the angel of the Lord at the ford of Jabbok. If you recall, if you don't recall, you can go back to Genesis 38. And God changed his name from the deceiver, the usurper, to one who overcomes with God, one who has wrestled with God and overcomes. That's what Israel means. And so he changed his name. So here's the people of Israel. But at this point, when we say the people of Israel, we're referring to a family the same way we would say the people of the Jewitts. Right? Same idea. And so here's the people of Israel, and there's a famine in the land, and so they go down to the powerhouse, the global powerhouse, which at the time was Egypt. They traveled down to Egypt, and they had storehouses. And if you remember the story, Joseph, when he went into Egypt, was the youngest brother. But then there was Benjamin that came along while Joseph never met him till later. But Joseph made these great big storage facilities, and he started overseeing all of the daily routines of Egypt. And so Israel's family comes down to Egypt, and they enter into this land, and they settle in this land. They don't just come down and get food, they settle in this land. And it sounds at the end of Genesis like a happily ever after. Joseph is well liked. The sons of Joseph have been blessed. Jacob has called in the children of Joseph as well as his own children, and has blessed them and bestowed that covenant promise upon them that Abraham, his grandfather had, or his father had, and he gives that to him. And so it seems like there's this happily ever after that is occurring. And then we turn the page. And in between the last page of Genesis and the first page of Exodus, about 350 years has passed. Now let me pause for a second and add an editorial. Because in this juncture, these people have become slaves, but they've also become great in number. In fact, Exodus talks about their multiplication, and the Hebrew word that the writer uses for the way that the Israelites multiplied is the same word that's used for when the plague of frogs hit the land and the frogs multiplied. So Israel, in this sense, in the Egyptian mindset, has become a plague upon Egypt. And they've multiplied, and they've become great in number, and the estimates range, right? We get this wide range of estimates as to how many were the people of Israel, but it was a large number. 350 years has passed. Now, here's the editorial, because we know they were crying out to God, because God said, I have heard my people crying out to me. I've come down to answer them. And sometimes we ask the question, how long, O Lord? Have you ever asked that? Did you know they had been slaves longer than we've been a nation? We're like, it's a pandemic. We're like, how long, oh Lord? It's been since March. Right? Get this in perspective. We've got to remember that sometimes, even where God is unseen, we would recognize when we're reading this story that God is still present, and He's still active, and He's still working. And this is what's happening. And so 350 years have, give or take, has passed. And there is a failure in memory. Pharaoh after Pharaoh has ascended the throne. And here's what we find out. In verse 8 it says, now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. A failure in memory. See, history changes because we don't remember things the way that we should. And the way we remember it sometimes is wrong, but it doesn't matter whether how we remember is right or wrong. The reality we got to deal with is sometimes what is right in front of us. And this is what happens is there is a failure of memory. Something has happened to the people of Israel. A ruler has risen, and he has forgotten how Israel became an integral part of Egypt. And here's the thing, problems always begin to arise when we cease remembering correctly. Like, why do we sing songs like Jesus Messiah, name above all names, beautiful Savior, Emmanuel? Why do we sing songs about the finished work of Jesus upon the cross and he came down and he's our rescue and our ransomer? Why do we remind ourselves constantly of these things? It's because if we don't, we will have a failure in memory. And as soon as that memory ceases, so too does the life that memory birthed. And this is what's happened. And what seemed like a happily ever after has very quickly devolved into all I can remember is bondage and slavery. No one remembered Joseph. They may have told the stories, but it wasn't an active part of their memory. No one remembered the migration from what would become Israel, which was the land of Canaan. No one remembered those details. They might have known the stories, but it was not the narrative that was shaping their life. What was shaping their life was the reality of the failure of memory of the kings of Egypt. And this is the reality that they're lived in. And this is always where problems begin. It's why we talk often about being thankful and thanksgiving, because we've got to remind ourselves constantly of what God has done, because it's always a reminder to us of what God is going to do. And so here we come to it. I want to look at this passage in two parts. The first part I want to look at is this idea of when the promise becomes a problem. Okay, so here's what has happened. The promise was given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, right? The promise was given to them that they would become a nation that would bless all of the world. Not just a nation unto themselves, but a nation for the world. And that promise was given to them, but the problems crept in. And it seemed like the problems became greater than the promise. Have you ever felt that? Right? I've spoken often about this here recently because it is the biggest reality in my life as of 3 weeks ago. Passing a kidney stone means that the only reality you have is that which is in front of you. Dana came out in the middle of the night on my 3rd stone in 2 weeks. I'm sorry, I know I'm repeating that, but that just deserves a plaque as well. She came out in the middle of the night, and I was huddled in a fetal position on the floor groaning. She thought I was praying. And I was not. I'll be honest with you. You're like, well, that'd be a good time to pray. I was not praying. I couldn't pray. Have you ever had that in your life? And it may not have been a kidney stone, but maybe you've gotten to a point in your life where the circumstances are so big. It's not that you don't have faith. It's not that you don't believe. It just seems like the circumstances, the problem is bigger than the promise, and it robs everything from you. It robs your identity. And this is what's happened with the nation of Israel. They may have had a vague memory, but the problem has robbed their identity. Their identity is not as children of Israel. Their identity is as slaves of Egypt. And so often this happens in our life. It's when the promise becomes a problem, when it seems like God is late on the scene, when we wonder when God will show up. I know I've asked these questions, and I dare say most of us in this room have asked these questions as well. God, where are you? Or God, where were you in the midst of this? How could you let this happen? Or the one I hear often now, God, how long are you going to let this go before you get sick and tired of it and you just return? Did you know God's not waiting to get sick and tired of our depravity? He's working to save humanity. That's how it works. He's not waiting until we get so bad that he throws his hands up in disgust. He's waiting until the church rises up and does what we're supposed to do and becomes the ransomer that he's called us to be. He's waiting for us, I think. When the promise becomes a problem, though, then the reality of it becomes the thing that binds us. I want to read these passages today. I want to read from Exodus chapter 1, verses 8 through 14. Here's what it says. I'm reading from the English Standard Version today. It says, "Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, 'Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land.'" You see what's happening? He's not worried that there's going to be a slave revolt. He's worried that Israel, the people of Israel, are going to become a fifth column in a war of one of Egypt's enemies. Israel's not the problem from the Pharaoh's mind in and of itself. He's seeing them collaborating with someone else and overthrowing Egypt. And so this is what he says. Let's deal shrewdly with them. Verse 11, "Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with heavy burdens. And they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread abroad." If ever there was a verse to memorize in this passage, the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and were spread abroad. Church, we have it pretty easy, don't we? Maybe the easiness that we have it is part of the culprit of why the church is not the agent it should be in the world. Go to China, where the church is oppressed, and what's happening? The church is expanding and it's growing. Go to South America, where poverty strikes every corner of the continent. And what you find is the church is blowing up. It seems to be, and in our own history, it seems to be that where hardship has been endured by the church, that is when the people of God truly become the people of God. Maybe we need to stop praying for the ease of our life and start praying for the salvation of the world and see what happens. But here's what's happening. The more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied. And then it says, "And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves." Notice how that works. Did you see the "so" in there? They were in dread of the people of Israel, so they afflicted them. Here's what you find. Whenever you are afraid of the other, our first response is to hurt another. That's what we do. You can always tell what our biggest fears are by the vitriol that comes out of our mouth. Where does it land? What does it point at? What does it talk about? And who does it degrade? And that is what you fear the most. And this is what happened even in Egypt. And it says, "And they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves." So here, the promise has become a problem. The present circumstances, in this sense, become the paradigm for how we live our lives. We shape our lives around our circumstances and we allow our circumstances to shape our lives rather than us finding our identity in something other than the circumstances. We begin to remember everything through the circumstances immediately in front of us, and the moment we begin remembering everything through our present circumstances is the moment that we cease remembering things as they really are. It's the moment when the hardships of our life convince us that God is tarrying, or God is late, or God is not present. When our heads know the reality is He is there, the circumstances of what is in front of us convince us and create in us an image that makes it look as if God is not present at all. You see, our memory becomes suspect. And everything, when we see everything through the circumstances immediately in front of us, we cease remembering things as they really are or they've really been. This tends to lead to two responses. The first is we tend to romanticize what has been. Right? As a slave, these people, maybe they were remembering the glory days when Israel and his family were shepherds in the land of Goshen and everything was good and they had the favor of the king. Maybe they remembered that, but I wonder if They remembered the way that the slaves of America remembered, which, if you've listened to some of those spirituals that were written, they always remembered forward. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to take me home. Right? They always remembered forward. They never remembered backwards. They remembered forward. But sometimes we tend to get stuck in this romanticizing of what has been, as if the good old days were really as good as we think that they were. We romanticize them because our present circumstances are so bad that we begin to remember through our present circumstances thinking, if only I could return to that. Let me tell you, you were just as grumpy then as you are now. You've just forgotten because the present circumstances have forced your memory that is so fickle to remember it wrong. The good old days were not as good as they were old. I worked hard on that phrase. I should have at least gotten a snicker. And we talk about them. I've found myself doing this as we talk about the new normal. Aren't there phrases you're sick of hearing? Right? New normal, social distancing, right? Go brush your teeth. Well, that's just one we repeat in our house. There's phrases I'm sick of hearing, and this new normal is one of them. And when we keep talking about the new normal, a lot of what goes on in my brain is I keep thinking about when can we get back to the way things were before March, before December, before whenever. And what if there is no going back? See, our circumstances might force us to romanticize the way it was. It's not any better, it's not any worse. It's just different right now. And so we can't do that. We get stuck there. We get stuck in the good old days that were not that good. So that's the first thing that the present circumstances as a model tend to do in us. The second thing we tend to do when we live in those circumstances is we tend to vilify others as a threat. Right? My happiness or my lack of happiness is because of this group, that person, or this circumstance. You ever see that? I pointed it out in this passage. This is exactly what happened in here. For them, it was the people of Israel, right? They saw them, they were afraid of them, so they vilified them. For us, we tend to do the same things. We see something as a threat to my happiness. The reason I'm not happy, the reason I'm not content, the reason I'm suffering, the reason this has happened is because of this, because of you, because of whatever else is going on. It's always someone else's fault. We like our scapegoats, don't we? Have you even listened to whose fault it is that COVID has come upon the world? On some accounts, it's come because of the Chinese government. On other accounts, on the opposite extreme, it's come because of Trump. On some accounts, it's come because of inaction in Congress. On other accounts, it's like, are you kidding me? It's a virus. It's a virus. It has come because the world's broken. And are some of our systems broken? Absolutely. But we always got to have someone to blame. Like, wouldn't it be nice if we could say, well, this has all happened because that happened. And so what we're going to do is we're going to drag him outside of town. We're going to crucify him and finally be done with it. That's exactly what happened with Jesus. Scapegoating. And we tend to do this. Can I tell you, church, it's time we stop scapegoating. Jesus was the last and final and perfect scapegoat. We do not need to fear the other. We do not need to lash out. We do not need to vilify. Right? Jesus took all of that and it's been done. So this is where the promise becomes a problem, where the present circumstances become the paradigm, the model for our life. But the other thing is when the promise becomes a problem, the victors tend to become victims. Have you ever met perpetual victims? Aren't they a joy to be around? I mean, I call them emotional black holes. Like you get in their orbit and they suck all of the energy out of you, right? Perpetual victims. And this is a tendency where everything makes us the victim. Everything makes us the victim. And we can acknowledge our slavery to this thing, but we love our slavery so much that we refuse to give it up so that we can continue being the victim. It's the people that I like to say that aren't happy unless they're unhappy. Right? And they become the perpetual victims, always needing more and never getting enough. And this tends to happen to us. Just our imaginations and memories tend to reshape how we recall the past. So too do our circumstances begin to reshape how we remember the future. And we always become these perpetual victims where fear becomes the dominant language, where fear management becomes the measure of all that we do. How much time do we spend in our lives managing our own fears? A lot. I don't know about you, but I do that a lot. I spend a lot of time managing my own fears. We begin to shape our lives around the fear of everything that might potentially threaten us. And so we huddle in, we draw close, we get in our holy huddles or our isolationist little corners in our bubbles, and the world is pushed out while we huddle in. We become the perpetual victims. I've got to say, I think that there's more than just continuing in the slavery of what we've become. Amen? I think there's more to this story. And in fact, this is what the book of Exodus is about. It's why I've entitled this series, A Gospel of Deliverance. Gospel means good news. And this is the shape, not just of the book of Exodus, it is the shape of Scripture. It is good news of deliverance, that God has redeemed. God is continuing to redeem, but the ransom has already been paid. And it's by grace. It's been given as a free gift already. You notice God did not pull Israel out of the land of slavery once they obeyed the commandments. In fact, they didn't even know there were commandments until they came out of the land of slavery. It was God's covenant language after having redeemed them that He wrote upon their hearts a law. And we've got to remember this. He is still drawing us out. Even as we were drawn out of that land so many centuries ago, He is still drawing us out by the blood of Christ, but He's doing it by grace. And where there is commands and where there is covenant, it is evidence of His grace, that He has already promised redemption to you. It's where the promises become the problem. It's where God reverses the story and the problem again becomes a promise. But here's what happens. Oftentimes when the promise becomes the problem, and here's my second point, small obediences will give shape to massive changes. Small obediences. Isn't it easy to be obedient in big things? Big things are easy. Moves, fairly easy. God calls, we move. We've said it, well, if I hear the voice of God, absolutely. But how about when you don't? When it seems like God is silent. It's the small obediences that produce the massive changes. So let me read some of these verses to give shape to this morning, picking up with verse 15. It says, "Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives." Now let's pause here for a second. You're going to notice throughout the book of Exodus, the Pharaoh is never named. He's the king of the world. Egypt is the powerhouse, right? Egypt is it. But Pharaoh is never named. But did you know throughout this book, 12 women are named, and 5 of them are in the first 2 chapters. It's interesting. And they seem to be, on the scale of things, they seem to be nobodies. But while Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the land, is named, is not named, we get the names of a couple of women in the delivery ward. Isn't that astounding? Think about that for a moment. Here's what it says. He says, "Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other was named Puah." Her first name was actually Winnie. Verse 16, "When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him. But if it is a daughter, she shall live." You're like, abortion is the worst thing that the 20th century has invented. It's been around a long time. There it is. It's actually infanticide at this point, but it's been around a long time. The evils of society. We're not as creative as we think we are. We're not as much of creative sinners as we think we are. We're repeating old stories. It seems to be the only memory we have that we get right. Verse 17, but the midwives feared God. Isn't that a great verse? They feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, why have you done this and let the male children live? The midwives said to Pharaoh, listen to the audacity. These are midwives, Hebrew slave women, midwives, who are speaking to the king of Egypt. Listen to the audacity. Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, kind of an insult, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes in or a month early. Dana is vigorous. That's what I got out of that passage. Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwives come to them. So God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. There's that word again. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people. Now he brings the whole nation into this. And he says, every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live. Now, here's what I want you to see. There's a lot of things we could pull out of there. We could pull out the fact that he was worried about Israel becoming a fifth column in a war, and so he was killing off the male children so that there wouldn't be boys or men boys to men who would come on. Okay, got to hang in there with me. There wouldn't be these boys or men who would join this other military group. So they were trying to get rid of some of the military component. But now what starts off as the responsibility of the slaves becomes the responsibility of the people. And this is how evil and sin always works. What starts close becomes multiplied around us. Sin is never a personal matter. It is always a public matter. But what we find in the midst of this is that there are a couple of nobodies who are remarkably faithful. They're faithful with what is right in front of them. Often we ask, where is God in the midst of the story? Where is God in the midst of the difficulties? Where is God in the middle of the pandemic? Where is God in the midst of the political upheaval? Where is God in the midst of the problem? Or asked another way, oftentimes we say, God, when will you do something? But now we see in this, in Exodus chapter 1 and 2, God is never mentioned. Read through it. That was startling to me. We're always asking, God, where are you? God is never mentioned in the first two chapters, yet people were faithful. Where is God in the midst of it? It's in the faithfulness of his people. In those small obediences. You see, when the promise becomes the problem, then small obediences will give shape to massive change. If we were to continue reading, we'd see these five women, Shiphrah, Puah, Jochebed, who is Moses' mother. She's first named. She's mentioned in these chapters, but she's first named in Exodus 6. We see Pharaoh's daughter, who is not Hebrew, becoming an instrument of God's redemption, and we see Moses' sister, Miriam, who becomes instrumental in this. And you think about it, the Nile, that was the instrument of death for all of these children. When Jochebed, Moses' mother, placed Moses in that basket, the same word that's used for the basket is the same word that's used for ark in Genesis 6. But when she placed Moses in that basket, she sent him down the very same stream that was a death to so many other children. But out of that stream of death came life through the faithfulness of all of these women. This is the irony of the story. The Pharaoh who is not named, who is controlling the world, is unable to stop the change of the small faithfulnesses incurred by the people of God. Isn't that amazing? Small obediences. Maybe just maybe while we are wondering where God is and when God is going to do something, God is waiting and wondering when we are going to do something. Maybe it's our obedience he's waiting for and not his intervention that we are waiting for. It is not the grand overtures of big obediences that make or reshape the story, but in this instance, the story literally hinges upon these small obediences, the quiet participation of people who take responsibility for what is right in front of them. We dare not bemoan the apparent absence of God when our lives do not reflect the reality of his presence. This is where the good news begins to take shape. It is good news first in the lives of those who remember rightly, but the fruit of that good news is in the reality of the small obediences where the good news becomes catalyst for change. Wow. You see, this has real impact in our life because we're always waiting for the voice of God. But here there is no voice of God, yet there was obedience all the same. Think of those small acts of obedience that have changed the course of history. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. What a small thing. It was right there in front of her. She refused to give up her seat, and a year later, after a boycott, a year later, the bus system was finally opened, right? These massive changes, or how about the little ships of Dunkirk? You remember that story? Winston Churchill was trying to figure out, 1940, he was trying to figure out how to get all of those, 300,000 Allied troops out of Dunkirk. And there was no way. They were hemmed in on all sides except by the sea, but they couldn't they couldn't mobilize, they couldn't get people in there. So he sends out a plea to all of the individual ship owners. And they organize, over the course of a few days, they organize a fleet of personal ships. And they transport over 300,000 troops, if I have that number correct, off of that space, that beach in that area. They get them out of there. They save it. And it was just because of the faithfulness of a bunch of people who were just doing what was right in front of them. You see, sometimes we're waiting for grand overtures. Sometimes we're waiting to do something when God is saying, do the thing in front of you. It's the little obediences, the Rosa Parks, the little ships, the Ron Jewitts of the world. Let me choke up for a moment while I talk about my dad. In 1985, my dad heard the voice of God. He was in pest control. He was fumigating silos and servicing restaurants, and I would go with him, and we would climb to the point of those silos and open the hatches, and we'd climb steeples and poison and then clean out the dead pigeons from the Catholic Church in the town I grew up in, all of this stuff. And they had a good life. We lived on a small farm. It was happy. We were content. And God called my dad to move his family to Colorado Springs and become a preacher. Out of the blue. No preachers in our family, no history, and you certainly didn't move. The whole family was there. And my mom and dad always tell the story that Dad had been wrestling with this for weeks. And one night when they were going to bed, Mom and Dad were getting ready for bed, and out of the blue, my mom and dad had not talked about this at all. Out of the blue, my dad said, I think we need to move to Colorado Springs. My mom said, I know. And that was it. They said yes. They moved us 4 kids. A 5th one came in Colorado. That's crazy, right? Not 9, 10 crazy, but that's crazy. And they moved us there and went to the Bible college. He's still pastoring his first church some 28 years later. And you know, I think I'm a pastor because of my dad. I think I'm here because of my dad. It's those small obedience that changes everything. So let's give some points of application to this. First of all, in the midst of a pandemic, again, I heard this from Caesar Kalinowski. I'm still working on it. What if COVID is not something that has happened to us, but is something that has happened for us? These are our circumstances. What if it's happened for us and put in front of us a real need? put in front of us a moment of real change, something that we can see. You see, the church needs to change. It does. We've been trying to figure out why the church in America and the Western world is plummeting, like in a free fall in attendance and participation. And it's been happening decades, but it has picked up its pace. And we keep trying to reinvent the wheels. We keep trying to implement models and ideas, and we keep trying to do all of these things, and everything fails. And what if God, like slavery for the Israelites, is allowing a moment in us that is going to shape us for the future? What if we looked at this not as, what are we going to do when it finally gets back to normal, but what if we look at this like, this is as normal as it's going to be, what are we going to do now? And we change and we begin to see in these small obediences that this is where real change begins. Just as the bondage of Israel shaped the people of Israel as a nation, so too will these times shape the church. Can we assume for a moment, even if it's in our imagination, that things will never return to how they were? Can we assume that for a moment? We can lament that, and we can even wonder where God is in the midst of it. However, while we are waiting for God to do something about this, I suspect that He is waiting for us to be faithful in the midst of it. If we spend all of our time trying to get back to the way things were, we will find that the past will become a slave master that will continually place heavier burdens upon us. And I dare say that can even happen in the church as an assembly, where it can become a bondage because we refuse to move beyond what has always been. However, if we learn that small obediences produce massive fruit, we will find that the people we are becoming is greater than the people we were. This is not the time for the church to huddle and to hide behind walls of our own construction, whether they be brick or mortar or videos and live streams. We cannot huddle any longer while we wait for God to move and people to come or people to come back. Let's assume for a moment they're not coming. Let's assume that. Instead, it's time for small acts of faithfulness that will reshape the way that we understand ourselves as the people of God and as the church. You're like, this feels like bondage. God has come to bring us through bondage, but the deliverance does not look like the slavery. And so it's a new land. It's small obediences. This is not one more thing to do. I don't know if anyone is like me, that sometimes you look at it and you hear these sermons and you go, oh, I don't have time, but I feel guilty. I need to be more evangelistic. I need to go to another class to learn how to talk to people the right way. I need to try to win the gas attendant over to Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior in this visit right now. Otherwise than that, I'm a failure. You ever felt that? This is not what we're talking about. Notice the Hebrew midwives, Miriam, Jochebed, even Pharaoh's daughter, they just did what was in front of them in faithfulness. So here's the thing. Here's some application points. And it's very simple. Look at what is in front of you. What needs a doing? That's what my mom always used to say. I'm bored. Well, good. What needs a doing? Look at what is in front of you. Open your eyes. You see, we've spent a lot of time bemoaning the fact that it is not the way it was, and it's not. I think we need to get over it. I think it's time. And I think we need to look at what is in front of us. Here's the second thing. Faithfully respond to what you see. What do you see? Respond to that. Here's the third thing. Stop waiting to reclaim what we've always done and start doing what can be done. The issue is not, well, this is what has been done, or this is, we can finally do something once we get back to this point. Maybe it's time we stop looking at what we can do when and start looking at what we can do now. So we need to stop looking at things that way. That is nothing short than a return to slavery. And then here's the fourth thing. Stop asking what should be done and start asking, what can I do? What can I do? You see, for me, this is the difference between being an optimist, a realist, and an idealist. Optimists, A pure optimist is someone who always has the brightest view of life. But here's the problem, is pure optimism disappoints, doesn't it? It always disappoints because the reality is different. Or a realist. I guess I'm a realist. I'm an idealist. But a pure realist will end in depression. Because you're like, well, this is what we've got. You know, Ecclesiastes. You know, it's vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Like there's no point to it. And so a pure realist will succumb to a life of depression. So pure optimism disappoints, pure realism depresses, and pure idealism disillusions. I'm an idealist. An idealist is someone who is always saying, well, it should be, and becomes very frustrated, right? I'm an idealist. I'm always looking at what should be, but the problem in my life is my idealism tends to fossilize me. It tends to make me freeze because what it should be is not what it is, and I don't know what to do because it's not what it should be. And it frustrates me. It causes us to freeze in the what should be's and never to really move. So we shouldn't be a pure optimist. We shouldn't be a pure realist. We shouldn't be a pure idealist. Instead, we are to be a combination of these three things. In fact, I think Paul called them faith, hope, and love. Listen to this. Optimism is what the Christian would call hope. God's got a plan. He's got deliverance. He's got a promised land. That's the hope that we have. The reality of Christ and what is in front of us. The realist in the verbiage of Paul is faithfulness. Well, what can we do right now? What's right in front of us? And we've got to deal faithfully with that. Whereas the idealist is the one who loves. Faith, hope, and love. Because that's what motivates everything. You see, it wasn't John Lennon who figured it out. What we need is love. Da, 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 da. Anyway, it was actually Jesus, but the idealist says, well, love is all we have, and it does absolutely nothing. And we say things like, well, love conquers all things, but if love is all you have, it conquers no things. You see, you need faith, you need hope, and you need love. You need these three things. And so I was trying to figure a word, if we're talking about optimism, realism, and idealism, I was trying to think of a word that would define that person who has all these three things. The word I came up with is a word that has bad connotations for it, and it's the word activist. Bad connotations sometimes. So instead, what I wanted to get at was this action idea that we are to be doing something, so I'm calling ourselves actionivists. I've invented that. We're actionivists. It's where faith, hope, and love come together. You see, when this happens in the scattering, that is in our going out, when we have these three things working together and our obedience happens in the small parts of our life, in the small acts of faithfulness, then when our scattering becomes the mission, then our gathering begins to make sense. Right now, I fear our gathering is the only thing that defines us. And actually, the church is supposed to be defined by our scattering, not our gathering. You see, the gathering is where it all makes sense. It's where it all comes together. You ever go through a week and you've just had a hard week and you come into worship and you're with brothers and sisters in Christ and it's like, okay, this makes sense. This makes sense. This is the way it's supposed to be. And it even happened with the nation of Israel. They were the people of Israel when they were slaves. They were the people of Israel when they were in the wilderness, but they became the nation of Israel when God's presence descended upon the mountain. You see, we see that even in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. Here's what he says. Now, if you obey me fully and you keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. This is the first time that word holy nation appears. They became a nation when they were gathered at the mountain of God, but they were not gathered until they had first scattered. You see, I heard this again this week. The scattering gives meaning and purpose to the gathering. And this is who we are. It's in the doing. It's in the going. It's in the faithfulness. You see, we may feel like we're under bondage, but even in the silences of God, we know that He is beginning a work. We may feel like something is lacking, but we know even where God's name is not present, God's people are. We may feel like in the moment there is no end in sight, but God says, in this moment, I give you the faithfulness of what you have in your sights. What you see, what you can do, and how you speak in the faithfulness of life into that. And so here we are. Here we are as Christians. Here we are as actionists. Here we are as the redeemed people, the branches that have been grafted onto the true root that is Christ Jesus our Lord. And here we are gathered where God is once again saying to us, now I'm about to scatter you. Will you go in that faithfulness? Will it be the small acts? Will you see what's in front of you? Will you do something about it? Will you be like Shiphrah? Will you be like Puah? Will you be like these women of faith? Will you be faithful in these small things? And he says, because I will hinge the whole story on your acts of faithfulness. Did you know there is no Moses without the faithfulness of Jochebed placing Moses in the basket? There is no Moses without the faithfulness of the midwives who refused to do that horrendous deed. There is no Exodus if there is no faithfulness of the people of God. And so now it's your turn. Now it's your commission. We call ourselves the people of God. We name ourselves the church. And we say we are even the redeemed of Israel, grafted on though we are. But that will be proved in the faithfulness of our obedience.